Morning, Rutgers Pamba students. This is Chris Young. This is our third series of lectures, week 3 of 4 in business ethics and professional responsibility. Today we're going to finish off all of our business ethics components, start getting into professional responsibility. Please be on the lookout for 3 to 4 readings that I'll be sending to you this week, all of them related directly to professional responsibility and to the AICPA's Guides to Business Ethics. That will be our lecture and last lecture next week. Also, please note that this week I will be sending to you your case. And this case is your only assignment other than reading for this 1 credit business ethics and professional responsibility course. I will give you or provide to you all of the rules, responsibilities of you, dates to return the cases to me. Most likely there'll be 2 hand-ins. I will probably come to the Newark campus to meet you folks and probably pick up the cases then. And then secondly, I'll also give you the opportunity to hand in the case to one of the administrators in the School of Business on the Newark campus. I would like to also come and meet you because I will be providing to you your strategic management course during the summer for 8 weeks, which, by the way, and thankfully is a live course, and we'll get a chance to interact and talk about business policy and strategy. So what are we discussing today? Today's class is about economic systems. In particular, we're gonna start our discussion about stakeholder theory and corporate social responsibility and the move to this idea. I also provided you a couple readings, how companies think differently or how great companies think differently. I also provided you a reading on CSR or corporate social responsibility. I provided you a reading on how companies get the most from CSR and their philanthropic giving. And then lastly, I also gave you a reading from Heath on the market failure to business ethics, which will be part 2 of today's lecture series. Next week will be, as I said, 100% dedicated to professional responsibility. And how does that dovetail into everything we've been talking about so far? So let's begin with stakeholder theory and corporate social responsibility. So it's very important for you to understand that many people in our society believe that businesses are not doing as much as they perhaps should be doing to engage the broadest of society. This has been going on forever, though we see a real business or anti-business agenda beginning in the 1960s and the 1970s, really taking off in the 1970s, specifically after the Pinto case. The general rhetoric that came out of the 1970s, again with cases like Ford Pinto, was that the businesses had little concern for their consumers. We had almost no care for the social order, particularly the increase or the rise in salaries of those who were in charge. So we cared limited about deteriorating social order, cared a little bit about the fact that women were getting paid substantially less than men, African Americans were getting paid less than all other classes or all other cultures. Businesses had limited to no concept of ethical behavior. Minorities and care for the environment were not considered. And because of these things that happened in the 1960s and 1970s, there's been a series of people, or there's been a series of groups or series of movements going against or pushing against businesses to become more productive organizations within our communities. And this is really the driving force behind CSR. It is a anti-business agenda. And when I say anti-business, it's not that we want to shut businesses down, but the folks behind CSR wanted to clearly restructure the benefits that businesses was providing to the society. So this is a graph provided by a colleague of mine, Ann Buchholz, who passed away a few years. But this is in her textbook. I like to share it for the simple reason that I think it helps solve, or helps me, hopefully it helps you, put in context the driving forces behind CSR. So on this graph, this 2x2 or this 1x1 graph, on the y-axis we have social performance. And when we say social performance, this is the social performance of businesses. And just to unpack that a little bit, what this Y represents is how good or how effective are businesses in meeting the social performance needs or the social needs of the greatest of society. And on the X is time. Now she plots this. This is theoretical in many respects. But what you see here is in the bottom, or on that bottom line, that linear line, that's showing that's business's actual social performance. So it's important to note that what this is suggesting is that businesses have actually been improving over time, over the 50 years that she looks at. They have been improving over time to meet social needs. But at the same time, and you would see that businesses are for the most part meeting the needs of society based upon 1960s. So if I just were to draw a line here, you would see that we're about equal to 1960s. So we now meet all of the social needs, or approximate the social needs of the time period 1960. Now, is that true or not? Again, this is theoretical. There's some research behind it, but for the most part, we are now meeting historical social needs. But as time goes on, society needs more. So the expectations of society further increase. Now, the problem is that you can see from the slope of this line is that people's needs, or society's needs, or expectation of business and businesses' provision of those needs is growing at a faster rate, therefore causing a greater social problem now and today than perhaps ever before, or at least since the 1960s. And there's, again, I borrowed this from Dr. Buchholz's book. She explains in her book that there's factors in the social environment that may be causing this increase over time. And it happens to do with affluence, education, and awareness. It's what she refers to as factors in the social environment. So as our society, how does this work? As our society becomes more educated, and as our society is now more aware of things throughout the world due to media, we're expecting more. There's rising expectations. There's rising expectations for affluence. And with this rising expectations come an entitlement mentality. Now, in my classes, my MBA course as well as my undergraduate course, I typically walk through an example. And the example goes something like this. Although I won't have a chance to ask questions of you, I'll just tell you what the outcome is. I ask students questions such as, how many of them have been told throughout their life that if they do well in high school, they will get into a good college, and everybody raises their hand. And then I ask, how many of them were told if they go to college and they do well, they'll get a good job. And I continue this for a period of time. If you get a good job, you make good money, you could buy a nice home, and the list goes on and on and on. So what's happening here is we are setting expectations within inside of society that if you do these things, you will receive. So what are we starting to create? Now, I don't want to say we're creating entitlement, but what we really are creating are these rising expectations that if you do this, then this will occur. And I continue my example by asking one student, how would you feel if you left Rutgers University and you didn't have a job? And almost always people say, or the person says, I'd feel bad. Okay, and I could go further. What happens if you had a really high GPA and you did everything you were supposed to do and you didn't get a job and you were out of work for 3 months? And they say I'd feel even worse. 6 months, even worse. 9 months, even worse. And I continue that. And then I add one more variable. Assume you're sitting home on the couch. You just sent out all of your resumes online. You made all of your phone calls to colleagues looking for a job. And you hear on CNN or Fox News or whatever news channel, whatever politically aligned news channel I should say, you listen to, you will hear a story. And the story says, Goldman Sachs investment bankers bonus is up 100%. Now, why do I bring that up? Because there's a couple things going on. One, on the back, you had rising expectations. Your expectations weren't fulfilled. So you start to feel a little bit disgruntled. And maybe you're starting to feel like I'm entitled to something. Well, then you get this news that these companies, these corporations, particularly in my example, financial services, they're making exorbitant amounts of money, and meanwhile, you can't get a job. What's that create? Well, that may create this idea of an entitlement. And when there's an entitlement, and there's enough people believing they're entitled to something, they start to create a rights movement. A good example of this was, I'm not sure if it's still really relevant today, but in 2007 and 2008 and 2009, during and after the financial crisis, many students who did not get jobs were being asked by various lending institutions to pay back their loans. And in that situation, we started to have students who felt as though they were entitled to a job. They took out these loans because they were told that they would receive a job, or it was anticipated that they would receive a job. And they created groups of or pockets of individuals that started to push on these institutions that they weren't going to pay. And there was a rights movement saying their rights were violated. And what did this ultimately create? It creates this idea of a victimization philosophy. I'm a victim of businesses, or I'm a victim of the bad behavior of corporations, or I'm a victim of the bad behaviors of the college. This happened 2008, 2009 again, especially among law schools. Rights movement pushing towards law schools because they were not, a lot of lawyers were not, law students, graduating law students were not able to get jobs. Meanwhile, they had this enormous amount of debt they had to pay back. They felt as though they were victims. And they were victims not only to the college, but they were also victims to businesses. And this creates business criticism. Now, when there's business criticism because businesses are not fulfilling the needs of society, it creates this general idea or there's a push towards changing the social contract, as I discussed in the very first lecture about this idea of the social contract. And the social contract is just saying that society provides businesses special benefits and privileges. In exchange, they expect to get something in return. Now, let's think about that. What do people expect? What do students expect to get from corporations? Well, jobs being one of them. Broadest of society are looking for services and products that are high quality, that meet the standard that they represent, that are fairly priced, that are healthy, that aren't going to destroy the environment, that are being made in an ethical fashion. They're not exploiting people throughout the world, right? These are just some things we tend to think about. And when we find out that corporations are not doing this and that there are victims out there, Sometimes the victims are asking for a change in social contract, or as we become more aware, society chooses to push for a new social contract between businesses and its constituents. So what does this do? A change in the social contract increases concern for the societal environment. So what are we looking to do? We're going to push on businesses to change the social contract, which then has an increase or a concern for the societal environment. This is a circular pattern. Sometimes business criticism increases concern for the societal environment, which then pushes for a new social contract, and this continues. And this is going to continue theoretically until business's actual performance meets society's expectations of business performance. Now, what's also interesting to note is you can just look back in a very, very short period of time, let's call it the last 2 years, and you can see how this has occurred. Take, for instance, same-sex benefits. So, same-sex benefits 5 years ago, or so, maybe 6 years ago, there was a group of people, particularly the homosexual community who worked with inside of corporations, who felt as though that there was a lack of justice for them and their partners. And they pushed for equal rights within inside of the law. And what did this do? This put criticism on businesses who did not want to provide same-sex benefits, and it started to create within inside of society most people or many people who said no, same-sex couples should get the same benefits as everybody else. And what do we have today? We now have a changed social construct or changed social contract. We also have changed laws because of it. So it's this type of idea where we now criticize businesses. They now change the social contract. Hopefully the concern for the social environment is a part of this. And this is going to continue until ultimately businesses meet the social needs of society. Now, what's interesting about this is, will this ever end? Right? That's what I always ask myself. Will this ever end? Will it ever be a place where businesses are meeting all of the social needs of society? And I'm not sure I know the answer. So what I want you to now think about is, what do you think by a changed social contract? I want you to think a little bit about it yourself. When we say there's a social contract that businesses are providing to society, what is it? Take a few minutes, think about that, and then come back to this lecture. There's many ways to look at this social contract. But if you go back, way back in history, prior to free markets and capitalism, companies did not make a profit. People did not make a profit from selling goods and services, at least not to the extent they did today. One of the important aspects that corporations have today that was provided by society via the law is this idea of a corporation. And this idea of a corporation shields individuals, shields shareholders from things the corporations may do. So now we remove risk from many of the for many of the shareholders, in exchange so that they can make money, in exchange so that they would invest in the company, and the company can provide goods and services for the broadest of society, and they can make a profit. However, as we give this benefit, we're shielding shareholders. We were expecting, or society, we would assume expects, that they do the right thing for society. Society gives them a benefit that they're shielded from lawsuits themselves, but that they would push on corporations to make sure that they're providing safe products, as I mentioned earlier, or high quality products, or products at the minimum meet the standards in which they represent. So those are some of the things that we would expect that society provide. We would expect that they provide jobs. so that people can actually have have the ability to live a fruitful life. These are, again, just some of the things, but there's many. I would expect that you to think about, where does social justice fit into this? Where does the corporation care about, wages, right? So what's a fair wage? Is that the minimum wage? Is that above the minimum wage? These are all of the components. These are all of the things that come into the social contract. And we're redefining this social contract as time goes on, but what's important for you as future executives, future accountants, is to start thinking about, what does the corporation have to do to meet the needs of the greatest of society or of the population? What do they need to do that addresses justice? Because that's really what we're talking about here, is just. What is just for society? So I'm not going to spend more time on that. I'm just going to ask you to think about it as we continue through the lecture. So there's a couple other things that proponents of CSR would like. Well, first, before I actually get into this, there's something called the shareholder model or the stakeholder model, which I'll talk about next. And what that suggests, and you learned about this in your corporate finance course, this is the theory of the firm. And the theory of the firm that you learned in your corporate finance course, most likely, is that the number one goal of the firm is to maximize shareholder value. And you focus just on increasing shareholder value. The important word obviously being shareholder, increasing the value for them. Not taking into consideration in that equation any other stakeholder. So what's CSR pushing for? Well, CSR, proponents of CSR, corporate social responsibility, are looking for corporations to think about other stakeholders and not just the shareholder. And in order to do that, they have really three main drivers. One, they're suggesting that corporations have to consider the community in which they are engaging, perhaps the community in which their factory stands, perhaps the rivers in which they're polluting potentially, or the skies in which they're polluting, and the country in which they're doing that, the population of people that are being harmed by their products and their pollution. So community obligations, one from a negative context, but then there's a positive context too, is what are you doing for the community to be a part of that community, in the sense that you are not just an employer, but you're also you're engaged in it. You're engaged in the lives of the people outside of work. And that tends to also work with this concept of paternalism, which proponents of CSR are asking for. Now, for those of you not too familiar with the concept of paternalism, it's really suggesting that we want to be a little bit more kind, a little bit more motherly in our engagements as executives. Now, I'm not sure if paternalism is the right word. CSR tends to use paternalism. I tend to like the idea of benevolence, or to be more kind, right? To think twice about our actions. That's number two. They want us to care more about our employees, to care more about our resources, to be more kind, because this is, at the end of the day, a human construct. Until ultimately robots take over the entire work environment, we are working primarily with human beings. And then at the pinnacle of this is this idea of philanthropy, giving back. Give back to society more. If you're making a substantial profit, what are you going to do with that profit? Okay, so you're paying people a fair salary and a fair wage. Yes, some of that money goes back to shareholders. But there's something else that you can do to society to help society move forward in a productive way. Call that philanthropy, charities in some respect. And what's the genesis of this CSR? It's really to keep government at arm's length. And companies that are doing some of these things, they care about the community, they care about their employees, they're giving back to the broader society with financial resources. They tend to appear as a good company. They seem to be doing the right things. And when you have companies that are doing the right things and adding to society, most likely, although that does not say that we will not have government intervention, but it will make government intervention less severe. So there's a 4-part definition of CSR that I want you to know. CSR encompasses 4 things. 1, you have to make a profit. A socially responsible company makes a profit. A socially responsible company makes a profit so they can put cash in the bank for a rainy day. You need to do that. If you're making a profit and you're giving it all away, you're not a for-profit entity and you're a not-for-profit entity, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about for-profit businesses of a CSR. Make a profit, have a pretty strong balance sheet, make sure you can be well aligned when there's problems or issues. Number 2, it's required that you follow the law. And when we're talking about the law here, we don't mean the letter of the law. We're talking about the spirit of the law. What does that mean? That means you're not always jockeying and looking for loopholes in the law so that you can exploit it. It's to look at the law, understand the law, or interpret the law for what it means, and to abide by it. So many of us in the corporate environment are always looking for a way or a loophole around the law. And we hire lobbyists and we hire lawyers, all of whom come together to create this exceptional argument so that we can skirt the law. That's not what we're talking about here. Number 3, you have to take into consideration of social norms, standards, and values. Now, this one for me is the hardest one to define. You consider social norms, standards, and values, and it's expected that you're considering these things. Now, what's important, it doesn't say it's required because it's so hard to determine that, and I'm going to give you an example in a second. And then 4th, they're hoping it's desirable of CSR's proponents that you have some discretionary funds to actually help a social cause. Let me give you an example of a company that historically has been considered a CSR, Chick-fil-A. So Chick-fil-A makes a profit. They follow the law. They follow the spirit of the law historically. Historically, they were considered to follow social norms. They were considered to have standards and values. And they were giving, and they continue to give, a fair amount of money away in college scholarships. Well, a few years ago, the company's CEO was reluctant to wanted to provide same-sex benefits to its employees because it violated some of his Christian beliefs. Now, that's interesting because prior to this new social contract or this social contract to push on companies, Chick-fil-A was probably up there as one of the more ethical companies in the way they worked. Now we have a new social norm, and arguably some people can say they're no longer a CSR. So you ask yourself, did they consider the social norms? Yes, they did. Did they consider the standards? They considered the values? And the answer is, of course they did. They did in all those situations. But they just had a different ethical standard. Their ethical standard is based upon their deontological ethic as a Christian versus some other ethical standard. So this now brings into question how we define a CSR. Is that company now unethical because they did not want to provide same-sex benefits? Or are they just as ethical, they just have a different ethic? Now, I'm not going to give you an answer to that. I'm going to expect you to think about that a little bit. What I tend to have, I tend to have challenges with CSR, this definition in particular. I would like to see or hear somebody say that a CSR is not a company that considers social norms, but is somebody that actually has an argument to why they're doing something based upon their ethical foundation. Right? So not consider, but tell me why you're doing something. And really, if you were to take the 16-week course in business ethics, we would be spending a lot of time working on your argument on how to make an ethical argument. And I think Chick-fil-A needs to make a stronger ethical argument. Proponents against CSR that think they're not ethical or they're not socially responsible should push or make a better ethical argument against them. This brings us to the relationship between social and financial performance. Now, there's three perspectives here. I think we're ultimately at perspective number 3. And what this is saying, what people have argued in the past, is that companies that had good social performance, meaning they were socially responsible, tended to make more money, tended to have better financial performance. And together, they created a good corporate reputation, which then further enhanced its financial performance, which then had more money to further enhance their social performance. And this was initially the belief. This is one of the reasons I actually got into business ethics, because I was reading some of this literature and I tended to disagree a bit. I tended to be more in line with perspective number 2. And perspective number 2 is, I thought that companies that had good financial performance, had good social performance, would have good corporate reputations, which would then drive more social performance, which would then drive more financial performance. So you can see, where are we? Chicken or the egg? What comes first? Does good corporate performance come first, financial performance, or does good social performance come first? And we're ultimately at perspective number 3. And perspective number 3 is that it depends. There's companies out there that begin as good corporate social performers. Patagonia is a really good example. Patagonia started, Yvon Chouinard started the company with good intentions, not to harm the earth, to create products that are socially responsible. And because of that, he was able to drive a company to have better financial performance, which created together a phenomenal corporate reputation, which then drove financial performance, which then drove social performance. Then you look at other companies such as Walmart. Although you hear negative things about Walmart, they're doing phenomenal things around social performance. And in their respect, they have phenomenal financial performance, which then gives them the ability to be good corporate performers and increase their corporate reputation. So we're definitely at perspective number 3, which is it depends. What comes first, finance or justice or social responsibility? And the jury's out, but I really think we're in perspective number 3. Another way to think about a socially responsible company and how they address social performance is by understanding how they track their performance. Historically, companies, especially publicly traded companies, tend to look at financial performance only. We tend to look at the bottom line. Well, CSR companies tend to have a multiple bottom line. They tend to look at things other than just financial performance, which by itself is also very important. They look at their consumers and what do their consumers have to say about their products. Maybe they look to their employees. Maybe they look to the community and understand what's the view of the community, or how much money have they been contributing to the community. But there's a more common way. It's called the triple bottom line. And the triple bottom line perspective says companies tend to companies may want to look at three spheres of sustainability. And the first one, obviously, how much profit they make, the economic and the financial. Number two is the social. How much value add do they provide to society? And there's a whole bunch of ways on how we can do that. We can track things like scholarships, that we provide scholarships, or in the case of a company like Timberland, what kind of training are they providing to their constituents in China, which is they have a program that trains women in China, or maybe companies like again Chick-fil-A or Aflac or General Mills. All of these companies have these social programs, and it'll be really it's really interesting when these companies are tracking the social performance, because they're saying, last year we provided this much to society based upon our profits. This year we've provided an increase, and then sometimes it's a decrease based upon how they do financially. But it's nice to track this because it's showing the broadest of society that this is important for these companies. And then lastly, environmental. I love New Balance. I think it's a great company. If you get a chance, you go to the New Balance website and you can pull down their entire report. They have a report that they put out about their social, their environmental, and their financial impact. And what you can see is all the great things they're doing, how they are taking sneakers and reconditioning them, or taking the rubber from old sneakers and using it again for new sneakers in a different way. So take a look at New Balance if you get a chance, and you'll see that they're tracking environmental programs and how they are helping the environment or minimalizing the hurt to the environment. And the whole goal of this triple bottom line is really to drive corporate sustainability, or sustainability across not just the corporation, but across the entire world. So again, when I first got into this industry, I think I said at the very first lecture, I'm an economist by training. I'm a finance guy by industry. And, I tend to, when I first looked at business ethics, in particular social responsibility, I said, I'm not sure. It sounds great. I love the idea, but I'm just not sure if this is real. And anytime I want to test my hypothesis about something being real, I tend to look at Wall Street. And Wall Street hard chargers, A types of personalities. And I want to see what are they selling. So I wanted to look at socially responsible investing. And socially responsible investing are people, consumers, investors, who care about only investing in companies that are doing good. And did people really care about this, or did they just want the lowest price product and they didn't care if they were harming the environment? So what I realized is that there was an entire industry that was emerging out of the 1970s at over $7 trillion in social responsible investments, and that number's a little dated. It's fairly higher than that now, closer to $9 trillion, I believe, the last estimate I had. And what was the genesis? My takeaway from this whole exercise was that consumers do care, and I would encourage you to Google socially responsible investing. There's many different funds out there aligned with different duties or wants of society. There's a Catholic fund, which I found to be pretty interesting. There's a fund that focuses just on the Islamic population and focuses on Muslim finance. There's Jewish funds. There's non-religious funds that focus on things like companies that do not hurt the environment, or companies that do not invest in cigarette smoking or pornography. So there's a whole bunch of different views and different looks. I'd encourage you to take a look at some of those funds. They're pretty interesting to see, and what we can take away from this is that this is something that's for real. I love the millennial population because they tend to mirror this. They tend to want to work with companies who are socially responsible, who are doing the right thing. That's just an aside note, but I do like to see, there's a bunch of research out on millennials, and we can see that millennials care a lot more about social performance and being socially responsible than probably any other group of people that we have seen, at least in my lifetime. So this brings us to another idea called the stakeholder theory. And again, CSR suggests that we should care more about other stakeholders. And in order to understand what a stakeholder is, it's very important for us to understand what a stake is. So a stake is an interest or a share in an undertaking. And I'm not saying company here because a stake can be multiple things. It could be categorized as an interest, like you all have an interest in Rutgers. It can be categorized as a right. That right can be a legal right or a moral right, and it can be ownership. Now, you could tell that this is this encompasses a lot of people. And if we're thinking about stakeholders of companies, it will incorporate or encompass a lot. So a stakeholder is any individual or group who can affect or is affected by the actions, decisions, policies, practices, or goals of an organization. That's everybody. That's a big, big, big set of people that corporations should care about, which causes some other issues. How do you address this great stake, this large number of stakeholders? And I'll give you an answer in a second. But before we do that, I just want to take you through the evolution of the firm. I think this is pretty important for us to understand. I've taken this from Dr. Buchholz's book because I think it's a very quick and good depiction of what has happened to the firm over time. So on your screen you have two views of the firm, and then I'll show you one more view of the firm. But let's just look at these two first. So if you think back, obviously none of us were born, but think back 200 years ago. Think back to times when we weren't making cars, we weren't making, there was no Google, there were no computers, horseback riding. Most people were buying their goods from someone who made the good themselves. Think about a shoemaker. Let's use a shoemaker as an example, right? So a shoemaker was the firm, which you see here. And the shoemaker had a pretty easy operation. They bought supplies from suppliers, and then they sold to customers. They also owned the firm. But then as time went on, we started to create corporations. We started to give investors the opportunity to be shielded from risk of the operators of the business. And now you can jump ahead to larger companies. Think about, let's say, Ford, 1907-ish, early 20th century. They're launching the first assembly line. Well, what do they need? How does that differ from firms of the earlier years? Well, they need more investors now. They need to raise capital. And because they needed to raise capital, they wanted to build a much larger corporation. So now what did the firm have? Well, the firm had additional owners and they had additional employees. Still had suppliers, still had customers, but now you had owners and employees. And if you think about it from a stakeholder perspective here, you really had four stakeholders. You had the owners, the suppliers, the employees, and the customers. The earlier view, or the production view of the firm, had really two stakeholders. Now, we're in the early 21st century, and we are to a point, or 110 years later, we're now to a point where many of our firms are substantially bigger than what Ford was 110 years ago. Many of our firms are global. And when I say global, it's not just two states, but it could be many, many nation states. And now we get to something that looks like this. It creates or if I were to look at the most complicated view, is in the center we have what's called primary stakeholders. Again, not dissimilar to what we just seen, but in the middle you have your business, you have your employees, your owners, your consumers, your government. Now this is government being federal, local, or state, and many of our companies are dealing internationally, so this is 2 or 3 or 100 different states at the federal, local, or state level. There's community, and community includes a whole bunch of people, right? So it could be just the general public, it could be environmental groups, or it could be civic groups. And then on the consumer side, there's many issues to take into consideration, such as the consumer, what's the product and liabilities associated with the product. You have social activists that you got to care about, and the list goes on and on. And this is primary and secondary. I might even be able to make the argument that there's a tertiary or a third view. And so what's the point? The point is, as companies get larger, as we become more global, we go from the production view of the firm to the managerial view of the firm to this view of the firm, which is, the most complicated view, or the current view of the firm. Now, my question to you as the future business leaders or advisors to future business leaders, who do you focus on? You're going to get calls, the people you work for are going to get calls on a regular basis. Who do you listen to? What calls do you take? You can't take them all. You can't address everybody's concern at the same time. So who do you care about? And when I first started again looking at this and thinking about stakeholder theory and moving away from shareholder theory, or the theory of the firm, rather than just focusing on the shareholders and everybody else, I started to ask myself, who matters more? And it was hard for me to decipher that. And then I came up to this triptych called the Mitchell triptych. What this graph is showing is that there's 3 components of a stakeholder that you should care about. The power of the stakeholder, financial power, political power, you define that. There's legitimacy of the stakeholder. Somebody calls you up on the phone and they're legitimate. Perhaps it's somebody from a civic group and they want to talk with you about environmental damage being caused by your product or your company, and they're a well-known environmentalist who has a PhD in environmental science. Are they legitimate? Probably, right? And then the third is urgency. You have somebody on the phone that wants to talk with you. Do they have an urgent matter? So think back to some, maybe hypothesize that you're the CEO and you're running a global company and you're getting hundreds of calls a day, and your admin or your assistant says you have somebody on the phone, and you quickly identify with that person, and you know that they have power, and you ask that, and you know that they have or they're legitimate, and you ask her, do they have an urgent need, and they say yes. So if you have somebody that has power, they're legitimate, and they have an urgent need, they're in the middle. It's what we call a definitive stakeholder. For today's purposes, I'm not going to hold you to the numbers. That's for another class. But for our purposes here, you have to think through if somebody has two of the three variables, they're probably somebody that you should care about. If they have all three, it's probably a phone call you want to take. If it's a person that has one of the three variables, probably somebody you're not going to take. So if somebody just has power, but they really don't have legitimacy or urgency, will we take that call? Maybe, but I'm probably not going to take that call, or I'm not going to address that stakeholder if I have somebody else on the phone that has an urgent need and is or has power, right? So again, this is just a simple way for us to think about shareholders or stakeholders, to think about who's the most important. I would also argue that when you're thinking about solving problems for your company, you're going to look to those stakeholders who also have the three variables. So if I'm trying to, let's say, solve an environmental concern or environmental issue that you have has come to your attention at your company, and you need to fix a problem, you need to address that issue, how do you do it? Well, you're going to find a stakeholder that's going to find your need urgent. You're going to find a stakeholder who has power, and you're going to find that same stakeholder who's legitimate, and they're going to help you. And so I look at this as not only this Mitchell graph, not only as something to help me think about who I should talk to or whose concerns should I listen to, but I also use this to help me think about who of my stakeholders can help me fulfill my mission as a leader. So this gets us close to the end of this first of two lectures today, and it's what is the strongest argument for and against CSR. So as I said earlier, CSR came out as a anti-business movement. There were people that were arguing that corporations had too much power, corporations were not doing enough good. So it's kind of caught hold, and there's a lot of people out there, myself being one, that tends to think there's a lot of value here. So I want you to think about the strongest arguments for and against CSR. Take a second or two, or a minute or two, turn off the video, and then come back. So here are some arguments against CSR. Those of us in the course or in life who have been trained, in the Chicago style of economics, where its only goal is to maximize profits. Some of us are going to still go back to that, and they're going to make the argument that that solves all social ailments in the long term. And we'll talk about that in lecture 2 today. There's a group of us. I tend to be here, right? If there's an argument against CSR, this is one for me. Business is not equipped to handle social activities. Most of you in this class have not taken a course on how to choose the most efficient social project. It's just not something we do. Number 3, it dilutes a business's purpose. Maybe it does. 4th, which I think is the most relevant, if corporations are already too large and too powerful, by making them a CSR, now they're being philanthropic and they're doing more, I think it gives them more power. So I'm not sure if that necessarily achieves its goal. And then the 5th is global competitiveness. If I'm trying to be socially responsible global company, I'm domiciled in the U.S., but I have factories, warehouses, divisions throughout the world, or I'm competing against other companies throughout the world that do not adopt CSR, am I putting myself at a disadvantage? And it's very possible that's true. And then arguments 4, 1, enlightened self-interest. And what does that mean? Are you becoming more ethical by doing this? Is your company becoming more ethical? Number 2, are you warding off government regulations? Is there enough here to be a CSR to put the government at arm's length? And if you have resources, why the hell not? Do it. You got tons of resources. What are you to lose? If it's true that companies that are socially responsible make better financial performance and you have excess resources, well, go for it. Let's see. Number 4, proaction is better than reaction. What does this mean? Give it a try. Let's see if it works. Many people in society are pushing for this. And if you're pro-action, you may get some benefit from it, and it'll help you from having to catch up later. And then the 5th, it appears as though public supports CSR. For those consumers who have the resources and have the knowledge of corporate actions, and have the wherewithal to pay a little bit of a higher price, tend to be, this is a broad statement, tend to be more for CSR. Consumers who tend not to have the financial means to pay a higher price, do not have the time necessary to learn about what corporations are doing, although they perhaps would like to pay higher prices for socially responsible products, and most often that does not occur. But for the most part, public supports CSR when they know about it. So those are the last 2 pieces for this this lecture. I'm going to now turn to a lecture on the market approach to business ethics, which is going to be much shorter.